Okay, I need you to stop what you're doing. I'm serious. If you're driving, great. If you're doing laundry, fine. If you're lying in bed in the dark like a feral little creature, perfect. That is actually the correct way to receive this information. Because tonight, we're going somewhere cold. We are going to a mountain in Russia called Polat Sayakal. I probably pronounced that wrong. And in the local in the local Mansi language, the language of the indigenous people who have lived in those hills for centuries, Kolet Sayako means one thing: dead mountain. Now, I want you to understand something. I have covered a lot of ground on this show. I have sat with you through some generally twisted material, but this one is different. This one has been living rent-free in my skull for months, and I refuse to suffer alone. That is the whole premises of this podcast, honestly. Communal psychological damage. You're welcome. The Dyatlov Pass incident. February 2nd, 1959. 9 elite Soviet hikers dead on a frozen mountain. No survivors, no witnesses, no rational explanation that satisfies every piece of evidence, and a Soviet government so terrified of the truth that they classified the files, scrubbed the weather records, and told the world the hikers' life ended from, and I am quoting the official verdict here, an elemental force which the hikers were unable to overcome. An elemental force. That's it. That's the whole official answer. 9 lives ended. Case closed. Elemental force. Have a nice day, comrades. What kind of elemental force crushes a human skull with the kinetic energy of a car crash and leaves 0 marks on the skin above it? What kind of elemental force rips a tongue clean out of a woman's face while she is still alive? What kind of elemental force makes 9-seasoned elite survivalists, people who train specifically not to have their life ended in the mountains, chose to freeze to their end, barefoot in the snow, rather than walk 20 minutes back up a hill to their own tent? That tent, full of warm coats, boots, food, a stove, 20 minutes away. They didn't go back. Not one of them. Welcome to the Phantom Navigator. I'm your host, and tonight we are going to strip away every layer of this thing. The forensics, the cover-ups, the physics, the conspiracy theories, the urban legends, until we're standing exactly where those 9 hikers stood on that slope, staring into the dark and asking the only question that matters. What was up there? Let's go. So who were these people? The first thing you need to unlearn in this narrative is that these were reckless kids who got in over their heads. That is lazy. That's wrong. And that is frankly disrespectful to the 9 people whose lives ended on that mountain. These were not beginners. A grade 3 winter mountaineering certification in the Soviet Union, the level they were all qualified at, required completing at least 300 kilometers on skis and surviving multiple nights and tents in sub-zero temperatures. You didn't get a grade 3 by being soft. You got it by being the kind of person who laughs at Blizzard. So let me introduce you to them properly because they deserve that. Igor Dyatlov. 23 years old, the expedition leader, an engineering student so talented that he designed the group's portable stove himself, built the radio equipment from scratch. This was not a man who made careless decisions. He was methodical, competent, and notoriously proud. Remember that word, proud. It matters later. Zenaida Kolmogrova, 22, charismatic, experienced, one of the strongest members of the group. Also Dyatlov's former girlfriend, which, totally fine on a 9-person camping trip in a tent. Zero awkward energy whatsoever. I'm sure that was completely normal. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20 years old, economics student, the group's treasurer. By all accounts, deeply religious, ferociously resilient, and sharp as a blade. She kept meticulous notes. She cried in her diary the night before the last leg of the trek. We'll get to that. Yuri Krenovis Sedsko, 23, nuclear engineer. He worked at a facility called Chelyabinsk 40, also known as the Mayak plutonium plant. You might know it better by the catastrophic disaster it produced in 1957. The Christum disaster. The third worst nuclear accident in human history. The Soviet Union hid it from the world for decades. Krivanosensko was on the cleanup crew. He went on a ski trip afterward while still contaminated. We'll be returning to that. Alexander Kolevatov, 24, nuclear physics student, with a history working at a secret research institute in Moscow. 2 nuclear-adjacent people on a hiking trip in 1959, Soviet Russia. Completely normal. Nothing to see here. Rustem Slobodin, 23, quiet, athletic, engineer, known for his stamina. His body would later be found halfway back up the hill toward the tent. He had a fractured skull, and this is going to stick with you. He had bitten off a piece of his own knuckle. We will be coming back to that image. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, a lively, funny civil engineer. His grandfather was a French revolutionary who was executed during Stalin's purges. Fun lineage to carry around. Yuri Doroskensko, 21, big, strong, and reportedly once fought off a wild bear with an axe. I want you to hold on to that detail. A man who axe fought a bear? Life ended running barefoot in the dark in his underwear. That's how profoundly wrong this night went. And then there's the anomaly. That one that makes every research eye twitch. Simon Zolotarov, 37 years old. 37 in a group of 21 to 24-year-olds, a World War II veteran, covered in mysterious tattoos, including one sequence of letters. Daramuzua, that never had been decoded by anyone. He joined the expedition the absolute last minute. He used a fake first name. His real name was Alexander, but he went by Semyon. He was photographed consistently. He was photographed constantly, but shared almost nothing about himself. And in 2018, when researchers exhumed the body buried underneath his name, the DNA didn't match his living family members. The man in that grave is not Semyon Zolotarov. We don't know who he was. And finally, the lucky one, Yuri Yudin. 21 years old, chronic joint pain flared up at the last resupply point, a small settlement called Vizhal. He turned back. He was the only reason we have any firsthand account of those final days, because he watched his 9 friends ski away into the wilderness, and he was the last person alive to see them. He spent the rest of his life in an apartment, papered wall to wall, with their photographs, reading the case files over and over until the day his life ended in 2013. He once said, and I want you to really hear this, he said, "If I could ask God just one question, it would be, what really happened to my friends that night? I am certain they saw something they shouldn't have seen." He never found out. Let's walk the timeline, because the details of the final days paint a picture of a group that was, by all accounts, having a genuinely great time, up until they weren't. January 23rd, the group leaves Sverdlovsk by train, in good spirits. They're writing jokes in their shared diary. They have a little group newsletter they called the Evening Oraten. Oraten being the mountain they were actually headed towards. The newsletter is sarcastic, funny, stupid in the best way. Classic 20-something energy. If this were a horror movie, this is a part where you're watching them laugh and you're thinking, please don't go into the woods. January 27th, they began the actual trek from Sector 41, a logging camp. This is the last place any real human infrastructure. January 28th, Yuri Yudin turns back, hugs his friends, watches them go. January 31st, they reach the highlands and do something called building a lebus. Essentially a buried cache of extra food and gear they plan on collect on their return trip. They're leaving weight behind. Just lightening up, getting efficient. February 1st, approximately 3 p.m., they began ascending the slope of Kolak Sayako. And here's where Dyatlov makes the decision that has been dissected for 65 years. The weather gets bad. Visibility drops dramatically. The smart move, the textbook winter mountaineering move, is to descend into the forest below, where the tree line provides wind protection and firewood is available. That's survival 101. That's what the mountain training they spent years on told them to do. Dyatlov doesn't do that. He pitches the tent on the open, exposed slope of the mountain in the dark and deteriorating weather. Why? The two most popular explanations: one, he didn't want to lose the elevation they gained. Two, and this is the one that says a lot about Dyatlov as a person, he wanted to practice extreme camping. He was the kind of leader who would choose the hard option specifically because it was hard. He wanted to prove that the group could handle a ridge camp in a storm. Pride. Remember? I told you to remember that word. So they pitch the tent on the slope. They eat dinner. They write in their diaries. The last entries are cheerful, relaxed. The last entry in the group's newsletter makes a joke about the next issue will be published from the top of the mountain. It's estimated they finished eating around 9 to 10 p.m. By midnight, something happened. Something that made 9 trained, experienced, rational human beings take a knife and slash their only shelter open from the inside, abandon every piece of survival gear they owned, and run barefoot into a 30 Celsius blizzard in the dead of night. In a negative degree 30 Celsius blizzard in the dead of night. The temperature at which exposed skin begins to freeze around -10 Celsius. They were running into something 30 degree colder than that, without shoes. Let that sit. The group was supposed to send a telegram by February 12th, confirming their safe arrival. The telegram never came. Families started demanding answers. The Soviet bureaucracy, being the Soviet bureaucracy, took its sweet time. On February 26th, a search party finally reached the tent. And what they found was the most forensically bizarre crime scenes in recorded history. The tent was half buried in a snow, partially collapsed, and it was cut open, not ripped, cut with a knife. From the inside, multiple slashes. This is critical. If you are panicking and need to escape a tent, your instinct is just go through the door. You unzip the zipper. You pull back the flap, you get out. The zipper was intact and functional. They didn't use the zipper. They cut through the canvas wall into multiple places. Frantic, overlapping slashes, meaning whoever held that knife was not thinking, I need to exit calmly. They were thinking, I need out of this tent right now, and I cannot wait for the 4 seconds it takes to unzip a door. Inside the tent, food, still mostly uneaten, suggesting they hadn't finished dinner or had just finished it. Boots, warm coats, the stove, all left behind. A flask with some alcohol remaining. A gold pocket watch. Navigation compasses. Rubles and cash. In 1959, Soviet Union, a compass and a pocket watch were luxury items. Valuable. The kind of thing that if you were robbed or attacked would be the first thing taken. Everything was left untouched. Leading away from the tent, footprints, 8 to 9 sets. Socks, bare feet, one person wearing a single boot. The footprints were not to be frantic, chaotic patterns of people sprinting in terror. They were walking in something resembling a group, moving steadily down the slope towards the tree line 1.5 kilometers away. They walked together through -30-degree darkness without shoes. Under control enough to walk in a group, terrified enough not to go back for their boots. The searchers followed the tracks, and what they found at the tree line, under a massive cedar tree, is part of the story that never leaves you. Yuri Dorosenko and Yuri Krivonisenko were found at the base of the cedar. Both lives ended, both stripped down to their underwear. The cedar tree's branches were broken off, going up to the 5 meters high. 5 meters? That's roughly 16 feet. Skin, tissue, and shreds of clothing were found pressed into the bark. Not on the bark, into it. They had built a fire. The fire had burned out. And here's a detail that makes the fire itself a horror story. Their hands were burned to the bone, not scorched, not blistered, burned to the bone. Severe frostbite had already destroyed the nerve endings in their fingers by the time they reached the tree, meaning they could not feel the fire. They had plunged their hands directly into the flames and held them there, trying to feel anything as their bones charred. The barracks guy, remember? That was Dorosenko. Spread between the cedar trees and the tent, on the return path, rescuers found 3 more bodies over the following weeks. Igor Dyatlov, Zinalda Kolmogorova, and Rustim Slobodin. Their positions told a story. They were crawling back towards the tent. They had made it partway up. The slope before hypothermia finished them. Slobodin had a fractured skull, and on his frozen hand, investigators found a wound that still provokes arguments to this day. He had bitten off a piece of his own knuckle. Consistent with either desperate fistfight against something hard or, I find this worse, a man in such profound agony or such unhinged psychological distress that he bit his own flesh while freezing to death. The remaining 4 hikers were not found until May 4th, when the snow melted enough to reveal them. They were buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine 75 meters further into the forest. They were wearing clothes stripped from the bodies at the cedar tree. They had taken clothes off the dead. And then their lives ended too. But these 4 did not have their life ended because of hypothermia. These 4 lives ended of something that official Soviet investigations spent years trying to pretend didn't happen. Let's talk about the bodies in the ravine because this is where case transformation transforms from tragic wilderness accident into something that defies conventional explanation. The pathologic on this case was a man named Dr. Boris Vozrokdeny. He had seen plenty of death. He was not prone to dramatizing his reports. And when he wrote up the ravine bodies, even he couldn't frame it neutrally. Nikolai Thibault Brignol. Massive skull fracture. The bone was physically depressed inward. Vozrozdeny's description compared the force required the impact of a high-speed vehicle strike. Semyon Zolotarov, the mystery man, had multiple ribs broken on the right side of his chest. His eyes were missing. Alexander Kolovatov had a deformed neck and a wound behind his ear. And then there is Lyudmila Dubinina. Lyudmila Dubinina had severe trauma on both sides of her chest. Multiple broken ribs. Her heart and other internal organs showed signs of massive impact trauma. Her eyes were missing. Her lips, part of her facial tissue, and tongue were missing. And here's the detail that separates this from any normal interpretation of scavenger damage. Her stomach contained a significant amount of blood, her own blood, which means her tongue was removed or torn away, while her heart was still beating. She was alive. She swallowed blood until she wasn't. She was 20 years old. Now, the thing that breaks every simple explanation for these injuries, the thing that Vozrozhdeny specifically flagged and that researchers have argued about for 65 years, is this. The force that broke those ribs and fractured those skull was massive, comparable to a car crash or a controlled explosive. The energy required was enormous. But there was no corresponding external damage to the skin above the fractures. None. No bruising, no lacerations, no abrasions. The skin over the broken bones was intact. Think about what that means. If you hit hard enough to break your ribs and cave in your skull, I am also going to leave a mark on the outside. That's basically physics. If force applied to the outside of a body damages the outside before damages of the inside. But these injuries look as though they originated from within, as if the force bypassed the skin entirely and attacked the skeleton directly. Vozrozhdeny himself described the pattern of force as being similar to a concussive wave, the kind generated by an explosion at a distance, not impact at a point. There's more. The clothing of Krivonisensko and Kolevatov tested at levels that were, and I want to use precise language here, highly radioactive. Not trace levels, not background radiation, high. Krivonesko worked at a nuclear facility, yes, but even accounting for occupational exposure, the readings on his clothing were extraordinary, as if he had been in contact with a radioactive contaminant and at some point very close to the trip. And then there's the skin. When the families of the hikers came to open casket funerals, they were horrified, not by the injuries. They had been warned about those. They were horrified by the color. The bodies were not pale, not the white or blush tone of a hypothermia victims. Multiple family members, separately, independently, without coordinating stories, described the skin as orange, brick red, deep bronze. Some said it looked like severe chemical burns. Others said it reminded them of extreme radiation exposure. The official explanation was that prolonged exposure to the sun's reflection on snow can cause bizarre post-mortem skin discoloration. The families didn't buy it, and honestly, after everything else in this file, neither do I. Here's where the story stops being a wilderness mystery and starts being a political thriller. The lead investigator on the case was a man named Lev Ivanov. He was a competent, experienced prosecutor. He took the case seriously. He followed the evidence, and then, in the spring of 1959, he was explicitly ordered from above to close the case and classify the files. He complied. He had to. This was the Soviet Union. But here's what he did. He remembered, and decades later, after the Soviet Union collapsed and he was old enough to not care about consequences, Ivanov gave interviews. He told journalists that yes, he had been pressured, yes, files have been scrubbed, and yes, he personally believed that the hikers had encountered something related to military activity that Kremlin was desperate to keep secret. Now let's look at what was actually done to those files. The opening date of the criminal investigation, February 6, 1959. The civilian search party didn't find the tent until February 26, 1959. The bodies of the first 5 weren't found until February 27th. The criminal investigation was opened 3 weeks before anyone officially knew the hikers were no longer living. There is an interrogation record on the official case file, still visible in the declassified documents, of a local witness named Captain Chunanov. It is dated February 6. The government was interviewing witnesses while publicly pretending the group was just slightly delayed. They knew. Days after it happened, they knew. It gets messier. The meteorological records for the night of the February 1st to 2nd, the precise weather data from the nearest military weather station vanished from regional archives. Not misfiled, not damaged, gone. The investigators who tried to reconstruct the timeline were forced to use estimates. The first page of the criminal case file, the original intake log, the document that would record who called in and when, was replaced with a backdated substitute. And then there's a civilian search party's testimony. When the rescuers arrived at the tent, one of them, a student named Boris Slotsov wrote contemporaneous notes about the condition of the scene. His notes describe the tent's main vertical support poles as still standing, upright, held in place by a pair of skis. 2 days later, when the military investigators officially documented the scene for a criminal file, their photographs show the tent completely collapsed, poles snapped, and buried. The physical scene was altered between Sovettsov's arrival and the military's official documentation. Someone went to that tent and changed it. But it wasn't just the tent. The survivor, Yuri Yudin, was brought in to identify clothing and equipment recovered from the camp. He knew every piece of gear that group owned, and he explicitly stated in multiple interviews over multiple decades that he found items that did not belong to his friends. A piece of fabric consistent with a military-issue winter jacket lining, a pair of Amatki Soviet military leg wraps. None of that belongs to Dyatlov's group. Multiple members of the civilian search party also reported finding boot prints in the snow around the tents that didn't match any footwear the hikers owned. Hard-soled military pattern boot prints. Separate from the barefoot and sock tracks leading down this mountain. The prevailing theory among serious researchers, a covert military team reached the scene days before the official rescue party, realized a classified operation was connected to the lives ending, and staged the scene in the dark, dropping a piece of their own gear in the process. And then there's the radio call. In the 1990s, a regional radio operator named Vladimir Yasovmenko came forward. He's been stationed at a nearby logging camp in 1959. He claimed that on the night of February 2nd, his equipment picked up a frantic SOS broadcast on a civilian frequency. Young, panicked voice, coordinates matching the Kholat Syakhl region. The problem? The Dyatlov group explicitly did not bring a radio transmitter. Too heavy. They'd left it at a base camp. If that SOS was real, someone else was on that mountain at night. Alright, let's work through the explanations. We'll go from the most rational to the most unhinged. Because that's the only honest way to do this. Theory 1. The micro avalanche. In 2021, a peer-reviewed study used the same computational snow physics code that Pixar used for the movie Frozen. I generally love that the most serious attempt to solve a Soviet Cold War mystery involved the frozen snow engine. To simulate conditions on Kholat Syakhl. The theory? When the hikers cut into the slope to create a flat base for their tent, they unknowingly undermined the structural integrity of the snowpack above them. Hours later, while they slept, a heavy block of compacted snow slid down and struck the tent. The people closest to the outside wall, Dominana, Zolotarov, Thebio Bignol, were pinned in their sleeping bags and hit with a crushing force. The uninjured hikers cut the tent open, dragged the wounded down the slope towards the tree line, tried to survive and didn't. It's clean. It's scientific. It explains the injuries. Here's why it doesn't close the case. The slope angle at the campsite is approximately 22 to 30 degrees slab. Slab avalanches usually require at least 30 and more reliably 38 to 45 degrees to initiate. The 2022 to 2024 LiDAR drone surveys, high-resolution 3D laser mapping of the mountain, confirmed that a specific spot where Dyatlov pitched the tent was geometrically too shallow for a slab to generate the force needed to fracture a human skull. When the rescuers arrived, the tent poles were partially still standing, a snow slab violently enough to crush the typically flattened tents entirely. The tent was damaged. It was not flattened, and explained exactly nothing about the radioactive clothing, the orange skin discoloration, the missing documents, the early criminal investigation, the military blueprints, or the orange spheres in the sky. Oh yeah, the orange spheres. Multiple separate hiking groups in the Ural region, operating approximately 50 kilometers away from Kholat Syakhl, on the night of February 1st to 2nd, reported seeing glowing orange spheres moving through the sky above the mountains. Their accounts were corroborated independently and are part of the official record. Soviet military, for its part, said nothing. Theory 2. Infrasound, the sound of madness. Kholat Syakhl's topography, under specific wind conditions, can generate something called Kármán vortex street. Essentially, the mountain acts as a massive whistle, producing infrasound sound waves below 20 hertz below the threshold of a human hearing. Here's the thing about infrasound. You cannot hear it, but your body responds to it. NASA has studied it. The military has studied it. Exposure to concentrated infrasound causes severe panic, nausea, vertigo, visual disturbances, and, critically, an overwhelming sensation of dread. A feeling that something is terribly, fundamentally wrong with no identifiable source. Viktor Golovanov, a researcher at the Ural Federal University, has argued for years that this explains Dyatlov's group's behavior. The sudden, irrational compulsion to escape the tent, the blind flight down the slope, the inability to think clearly enough to grab boots. It explains the flight. It does not explain the crushed ribs and the missing tongue. Theory 3. The military weapon, rocket fuel. Kholat Syakhl sits downwind from multiple Soviet military test sites, including Baikonur Cosmodrome and Kasputin Yar. In 1959, the Soviet military was actively testing R-7 ICBM rockets. The rocket fuel used in those tests included a compound called unsymmetrical dysmethylhydrazine and nitric acid. Both are hideously toxic. Both are caustic and burning. A mid-air abort or fuel dump over the northern Urals would probably produce a descending cloud of burning chemical vapor. If that cloud settled over the tents, the hikers would have woken to a sensation of burning from the inside out. They would slash the tents to breathe, run blind to escape the heavy vapor descending the slope. The vapor would cause internal chemical lung burns, consistently with the internal only damage noted from the autopsies. The nitric acid compounds would cause severe skin discoloration, consistent with the orange-bronze skin at funerals. The orange spheres people reported in the sky could be a rocket's re-entry. The classified files, absolutely consistent with a military accident the Kremlin needed to bury. The flaw? No shrapnel, no impact craters, no chemical residue was ever officially documented at the site. Though, and I just wanted to leave this here, the meteorological records from that night were deliberately destroyed. So the exact atmospheric conditions were never reconstructed. Just saying. Theory 4. The KGB spy exchange gone wrong. Researcher Alex Redikin spent years building the case for one, and it is uncomfortably detailed. The setup. During the Cold War, the CIA used deep insertion agents into the Soviet territory. To expose them, the KGB ran controlled deliveries, operations where the Soviet agents, posing dissidents, offered to sell classified materials to identify the foreign spies. The allegation? Krivonischenko and Kolevatov, the two with nuclear backgrounds, were KGB assets tasked with bringing highly radioactive material to a dead drop point at Sayako. They were supposed to hand it off to CIA operatives disguised as random hiking group under surveillance. Something went wrong. The foreign agents made the group, or the group broke protocol, or someone panicked. To prevent an incident that would blow an active intelligence operation on Soviet soil, and unable to use firearms without creating obvious evidence, the foreign operatives allegedly forced the hikers into the freezing, expecting the cold to handle it cleanly. When some survived and started a fire, drawing attention to the location, they came back and finished it. The crushing injuries in the ravine inflicted by trained operatives who knew how to break bones without leaving surface marks. It explains the radioactive clothing. It explains the cover-up. It explains Zolotarov's camera, which he grabs instead of his boots. Because his instinct as a veteran operative was to photograph whoever was doing this. The water-damaged film inside a miraculously intact camera casing, whatever he photographed, they made sure no one would ever see it. Theory 5. Zolotarov himself. This is the one the Russian conspiracy community cannot let go of. A 37-year-old ex-military man with undecoded tattoos, a fake first name, mysterious ties to World War II military intelligence, who joined a universal university hiking club at the last minute, carried a camera into a negative 30-degree blizzard instead of boots, and whose exhumed remains don't match his family's DNA. Who was he? The double agent theory suggests Zolotarov was himself either a KGB handler embedded in the group to monitor Krivonetsko and Kolevatov, or a foreign operative who got close to the group to extract the radioactive material. Either way, his true identity was sensitive enough that the Soviet government replaced his body after the fact. And somewhere in the Ivanosko cemetery, under a mountain bearing his face, is a dead man whose name we still don't know. Here's the thing about those theories. Pick your favorite. Go ahead. Avalanche, rocket fuel, spy operation, infrasound, whichever one you want to sleep best with. Now try to answer these. Frame 34, the last photograph on Krivonetsko's camera, a completely dark frame except for a blurry, luminescent mass with a dark center. Some say it was an accidental exposure, a light leak, camera shake, but it's the last frame on the roll, taken after the group had eaten dinner, in good spirits, inside a tent at 9 p.m. There's no photographic reason for the final frame to be an accidental exposure of glowing anomaly in the dark. Unless someone deliberately took a picture of something outside the tent. The biological clock anomaly. When pathologists examined the hands and feet of the 4 ravine victims, they found severe maceration, the wrinkling and softening of skin that occurs when a body is submerged in wet conditions for an extended period. To achieve the level of maceration documented in those autopsies, those 4 bodies would have needed to be in contact with running water or sustained moisture for 10 to 15 hours after death. They were found in sub-zero temperatures where water freezes on contact. Those 4 either survived far, far longer than the official timeline claims, lying in a melting snow den in wet conditions, slowly having their lives ended, or their bodies were kept somewhere else entirely before being placed in the ravine. The digestion paradox. Rustin Slobodin's stomach, when examined, contained a significant amount of partially digested food, enough to suggest he ate a full meal only a few hours before he died. But according to the official timeline, the group finished dinner around 9 to 10 p.m. And then the tent was abandoned shortly after. If Slobodin was digesting a full meal when his life ended, he might have survived until early morning hours, potentially seeing something the others didn't. Or the events happened much earlier in the evening than the official timeline records. The liver mortis mismatch. Liver mortis is the settling of the blood in the body after a heart stops. It is one of the most reliable time of death indicators in forensic pathology. It creates permanent discoloration in whatever side of the body is facing down. Several of the first group, the 5 found on the slope and the tree line, showed blood pooling consistent with lying on their backs. They were found lying face down. Their bodies were moved after their lives ended, before the official search party arrived. Someone was on that mountain before the rescuers got there. Someone moved their bodies. And then there's the final psychological horror. I want you to generally sit with this. You are Dyatlov or Kolmogorova, or any uninjured 3 who made it partially back up to the slope before your life ended. You are an elite survivalist. You have been trained specifically for this scenario. You understand exactly what hypothermia does to a body. You know the math. Your tent is 1.5 kilometers up the hill, 20 minutes of walking. Inside that tent, coats, boots, food, a stove, everything you need to survive the night. The thing that drove you out of it, whatever it was either gone now or it left with the others. Your life is going to end if you don't go back. You know that. And you still don't go. You stay under that tree. You strip clothes off bodies of your dead friends. You lay down in the snow. You let it happen. Whatever was on that ridge, they made the calculated, conscious decision that it was infinitely more terrifying than their own deaths. Let's go sideways for a minute into the stuff that lives in the dark corners of Russian internet forums. Manzi oral tradition. And the memories of the old men who were told to stay quiet. The curse of the searchers. And Yekaterinburg, formerly Sverdlovsk. There had been a persistent rumor for decades that an unusual number of the civilian student volunteers who helped recover the bodies in 1959 lives ended in strange ways afterward. Mountaineering accidents, aggressive cancers in their 30s, a few who disappeared entirely into the Soviet Gulag system after talking too openly about what they saw at that site. Is it a statistic anomaly? Maybe. Could you explain the cancers of the site that was radioactively contaminated and the searchers were exposed? Could explain the Gulag disappearance entirely through Soviet politics. Or, I don't necessarily believe this. I'm just your pilot on this tour. The mountain had a long memory. The Golden Woman. The Manzi people have a legend about an ancient idol buried deep in the northern Urals. The Zlata Baba, the Golden Woman, a solid gold statue of a goddess said to emit a supernatural aura that drives anyone who approaches it into a frenzy of madness, forces them to tear off their clothes, run until their heart stops. A persistent regional rumor holds that Dyatlov group wasn't just hiking, They were using their elite navigation skills to search for it. And they found the boundary. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying it's a wild coincidence that a primary symptom of the Golden Woman curse, tearing off your own clothes and running into a mad frenzy, is exactly what Dyatlov groups appeared to do. The 10th hiker. During the initial search, some members of the rescue team reported finding what appeared to be 10 sets of ski tracks leading towards the base of the mountain, while only 9 people were registered on that expedition log. The official report: optical illusion caused by overlapping ski patterns. The weird detail: before the final 4 bodies were even recovered from that ravine, the Soviet authorities had quietly ordered a preparation of 10 coffins. The dead zone radio silence. Among Sverdlovsk region, amateur radio operators, a rumor had been circulated since 1959. For 48 hours following February 2nd, a dead zone of complete electromagnetic silence blanketed a 100-kilometer radius around Kolat-Sayakol. Civilian frequencies went dark. Shortwave signals from Moscow were blocked entirely. When radio returned on February 5th, the first transmissions interception by the operators were coded high priority military communications between the Ural Command and the Kremlin. 3 weeks before anyone was supposed to know the hikers were not alive. And then there's Lyudmila Dubinina's diary entry. The night before Yuri Yudin turned back, the last night of the full group was together, something shifted in Dubinina's mood. The woman describes, in all accounts, a fierce, resilient, and deeply composed wrote an entry that researchers described as a student uncharacteristic emotional collapse. She wrote about unspoken tensions, but a feeling of impending isolation. And Krivanosensko, the nuclear engineer, the man with the radioactive clothes, pulled Yudin aside before he left. He pressed something into Yudin's hand, a small, hand-carved wooden bear amulet, and he said, quietly, so the others couldn't hear, "Keep this. The mountain doesn't want all of us." Yudin kept it. He kept it until the day he was no longer alive. So here we are. We started at a train station in the Sverdlovsk with 9 people who were absolutely certain they knew how to handle the mountain. And we end here in the dark with 65 years of unanswered questions and a case file that the Russian government still hadn't fully opened. Here's what I actually think happened. Not that it matters, but you've been with me this long, so you deserve my read. I think something happened on that ridge that night that had 2 components, and trying to explain a whole thing with one cause is why nobody gets a satisfying answer. I think something military, atmospheric, infrasonic, electromagnetic, something hit that tent in a way that was both physically damaging and psychologically catastrophic. Something that injured 4 of them severely and drove the others into a state of pure primal flight. Something that left radioactive traces and orange chemical burns and glowing lights in the sky. And I think the Soviet government knew within days, and I think they got there first. I think they moved things, scrubbed things, replaced things, and classified the whole nightmare under elemental force. Not because the truth was embarrassing, but because the truth was kind of a superpower in the middle of a Cold War could not afford to admit. Either that their their own weapons failed catastrophically and ended their own citizens, or there was something on that mountain they didn't put there and couldn't explain. But here's where I kept coming back to the detail I cannot route around. The thing that even if you hand me every classified Soviet file and every piece of evidence, even if you solve every piece of this, I think the deepest, truest, most unsolvable part of the Dyatlov past isn't what happened at the tents. It is what happened at the cedar trees. 3 people's lives ended trying to crawl back to the tent. They tried. Whatever paralysis grips the others didn't grip them completely. They made the move. They started back up that hill, and they didn't make it. They laid down, and their lives ended in the open. And the 4 in the ravine, the ones with the shattered ribs and the missing eyes, they built a shelter. They stripped the dead for warmth. They survived long enough to feel hope and lose it again. None of them called for help. None of them left a final message. None of them wrote the last note in the snow, which experienced outdoor people do. They just stopped. Yuri Yudin said it best. He spent 54 years reading every document, interviewing every survivor, examining every theory. And at the end of all of it, at the end of his life, he looked at a reporter and said, "They didn't look like people who died of the cold. They looked like people who had been aged by 100 years in a single night." When Yudin died in 2013, his final wish was to be buried in Yekaterinburg alongside his 9 friends. He had been trying to solve their deaths for 5 decades, and he never did. So he joined them instead. The mountain still doesn't tell its secrets. Colette Sayoko, Dead Mountain. I've spent months on this case file, and the thing that keeps giving me the thing I can't shake is this. We are very comfortable in the modern world with the idea that everything has an explanation, that every locked room has a key, that every mysterious waiting for the right forensic technique or the right declassification request. We believe that given enough time and enough data, everything resolves. The Dyatlov Pass is a reminder that some things don't resolve. Some crimes close with an unsolved stamp. Some mountains keep what they take. And somewhere in the northern Urals, there is a slope called Dead Mountain where 9 people, 9 brilliant, trained, seasoned, fearless people, made the decision that whatever was up there in the dark was worse than dying. And we still don't know what it was. And we still don't know. That's it for tonight. I'm your host. You've been listening to the Phantom Navigator. If this one got under your skin, good. It means it worked. Share it with someone who won't sleep tonight either. Leave a review. Tell me what you think happened in the ridge, because I read every single one of them, and some of you have sent me theories that have generally kept me up at 3 in the morning in a way I'm not sure was healthy. The files are out there. The mountain is still there. Colette Sayakal hasn't moved. And somewhere in a cemetery in Yekaterinburg, 10 people are buried together. 9 who went up a mountain, and 1 who spent his whole life wishing he had. Stay curious, stay paranoid, and for the love of God, if you're ever in a Ural Mountains and someone suggests pitching a tent on an exposed ridge in a blizzard, use the zipper.